There are battles in World War II that everyone knows. They are the fixed points in the historical constellation. Normandy, a brutal, amphibious push for freedom. Kursk, the titanic clash of armor in the Eastern European dust. Midway, the turning point where the Pacific fate was sealed by fire and aluminum. These are the epics, enshrined in history, taught in schools, and immortalized in film. But for every luminous epic, there is a shadow conflict. A desperate, sharp, sudden engagement that was so shocking, so utterly embarrassing to one side, or so devastatingly unexpected to the other, that the historical record decided, almost subconsciously, to quietly bury it. They were not forgotten by the men who fought them, but they were certainly lost to the masses. This is the story of one such battle. It lasted only a few hours. It involved fewer than 100 machines in total. And yet, if the fickle hand of fate had twitched just a little differently, if one decision had been reversed, or if a handful of desperate pilots had possessed just a little more luck, the entire trajectory of the Western Front in 1944 could have shifted. The Allied timetable could have been thrown into chaos, Paris might have waited longer for liberation, and the cost of final victory might have escalated beyond measure. This was the forgotten engagement the Germans codenamed Operation Gegenlicht, Counterlight. A desperate, last-gasp moment when a small, forgotten contingent of pilots attempted something so audacious, so utterly suicidal, that it nearly rewrote the final year of the war. The anatomy of defeat. To understand Operation Gegenlicht, we must first understand the state of the Wehrmacht in the late summer of 1944. It was not the confident, conquering force of the Blitzkrieg years. It was a staggering giant, bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Eastward, Operation Bagration had chewed up the heart of Army Group Center, leaving a vast, smoking hole in the line stretching toward the Baltic. In Italy, the Allies were slowly grinding up the peninsula. And, of course, the great, bloody hinge had finally opened in the West, D-Day. By August 1944, the optimism that followed the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead was palpable. The Falaise pocket had closed, trapping or killing hundreds of thousands of Germany's best fighting men. General Patton's Third Army, fueled by gasoline and audacity, was tearing across France, operating so far ahead of its own supply lines that the logistics chain, the famous Red Ball Express, was groaning under the strain just to keep up. The mood among the Allied commanders was one of victorious inevitability. They were playing offense, driving hard toward the Seine, toward Paris, and toward the Rhine. Conversely, the German High Command OKW was a toxic mix of denial and panic. Hitler, obsessed with fortresses and suicidal counterattacks, often intervened disastrously. But even among the most level-headed commanders, a brutal truth was sinking in: the war could not be won. It could only be prolonged. Prolonging the war meant delaying the inevitable. And in the West, delay meant stopping, or at least crippling, Patton's headlong rush. The problem: Allied air dominance. The single greatest factor making delay impossible was not tanks or men, but air power. The Allied air forces, the USAAF and the RAF, had achieved a level of dominance over the Western European skies that was unprecedented. By day, the sky belonged to the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. By night, the Avro Lancasters and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses rained destruction. German units attempting daytime movement were immediately spotted and decimated by fighter bombers, known grimly as Jabbo, by the German troops. A tank column was a target, a concentration of troops was a massacre, a train was simply a fire waiting to happen. This was not a war of maneuver, it was a war of endurance beneath a relentless storm of steel and high explosives. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of German might, was now a hollow shell. Experienced pilots were gone, chewed up in the costly Battle of Britain, or vaporized over the Russian steppe. The few remaining aces flew increasingly obsolete aircraft, constantly outnumbered by an average ratio of 10-1. Fuel was scarce, spare parts were non-existent, and ground crews worked under constant threat of bombing. The consequence was simple: the Allies moved freely. Their supply lines were largely untouched by the Luftwaffe, and their command structure could operate without fear of disruption from above. This is where the idea for Operation Gegenlicht, the counterlight, was born, in the darkest, most desperate corners of the German command structure. The architects of desperation. The plan did not come from the headquarters of the OKW, it emerged from the operational level, specifically from Generaloberst Joseph Kammhuber, the former head of the German Night Fighter Force, and later, the commander of the Luftflotte 5 Air Fleet 5. Kammhuber was a realist. He understood that a frontal assault against Allied formations was impossible. He knew that the only place the Luftwaffe still possessed a fleeting, tenuous advantage was in surprise and unconventional tactics. Kammhuber's idea was breathtakingly simple, and dangerously complex. If we cannot control the air over the battlefield, we must neutralize the nerve center that controls the Allied armies. The target. The forward headquarters of the Third Army. Patton's rapid advance demanded a close, highly mobile command structure. By mid-August, this headquarters was located not in a fortified bunker, but in a series of hastily established command posts, often centered around a small provincial town or even a large estate, usually within 50 to 100 miles of the main front lines. Crucially, these forward areas, far removed from the actual fighting, were assumed to be safe. The air umbrella over them was effective, but the anti-aircraft defense was often less robust than near major cities or frontline depots, precisely because nobody expected a deep strike. Kammhuber's intelligence chief, Major Albrecht Hinkel, had identified a temporary, vulnerable location near the town of Chartres. It was a massive chateau, Chateau de Maintenon, surrounded by thick parkland, perfect for concealing radio masts, mapping rooms, and staff cars, but vulnerable from a low-level, high-speed approach. The operational parameters were insane. Deep penetration. Fly over 150 miles behind enemy lines. Low altitude. Fly at treetop level for maximum surprise and evasion of early warning radar. Specific target. Hit a single, small, non-industrial military target with absolute precision. No escort. The fighter bombers would fly alone, unescorted, betting everything on speed and the element of shock. This was not an attack designed to kill thousands of GIs or destroy a huge amount of materiel. It was a decapitation strike. If Patton, his key staff, and their essential communication links could be eliminated or severely disrupted for even 48 hours, the Third Army, which operated on the sheer force of its commanders would momentarily stall. A stalled Patton meant an opportunity for the battered German armies to consolidate, regroup panzer divisions, and launch a localized counterattack that could buy weeks, perhaps even months, of vital time. This was the counterlight, a flash of desperate brilliance to momentarily blind the victorious enemy. The chosen weapon, the Junkers Ju-88 G6. To pull off such a mission, they needed a special machine, and a special kind of pilot. The conventional fighter bombers like the FW-190 or the Me-109 lacked the necessary range and payload for a long-distance, destructive strike. They settled on a machine repurposed from a different mission entirely, the Junkers Ju-88 G6. The Ju-88 was the quintessential German wartime utility aircraft, serving as a bomber, torpedo plane, reconnaissance platform, and, crucially, a night fighter. The G6 variant was built primarily for aerial interception at night, equipped with powerful, fast-firing cannons often 20mm and 30mm mounted in a belly tray, Badenwan, and sometimes upward-firing Schrägmusik installations. Most importantly, it had a long range, excellent speed for its size, and robust construction. For Gegenlicht, the bulky radar antennae, Neptun or Liechtenstein, were stripped off the nose to reduce drag and improve top speed. The Schrägmusik guns were often removed or replaced with forward-firing cannons. The aircraft was heavily loaded with high-explosive bombs, usually 250 kilograms bombs or a combination of smaller fragmentation bombs, and enough fuel to make the one-way trip and a nervous dash back home. These were not bombing runs, they were strike runs. The Ju-88s, now operating in daylight, a time they had long abandoned, would scream across the French countryside at near top speed, close to 600 km per hour or 370 miles per hour at low altitude, relying on the terrain mask and sheer, terrifying speed to survive. The ghosts of the Nachtjäger. The men chosen for this mission were not the fresh-faced graduates of training schools. They were night fighters, the Nachtjäger. These were the veterans of the brutal, secret air war fought in the black skies over the Reich, a war of silent pursuit, radar plots, and sudden, explosive destruction. They were accustomed to flying alone, navigating by intuition and specialized equipment, and dealing with technical failure and sudden death in the dark. Flying low in daylight was an entirely different beast, but these men possessed the essential quality needed, a deeply ingrained, professional recklessness. One of the key figures was Major Eric Scholl, a grizzled veteran with over 50 night victories and the commander of the small, hand-picked Sonderkommando special detachment tasked with the mission. Scholl was pragmatic, demanding, and utterly loyal to his crew. He harbored no illusions about the overall war effort, but he believed in the mission's objective, buying time for the German people, if not victory for the Reich. Training was conducted in secret, using remote airfields near the German-French border. Pilots practiced low-level navigation over mock-up targets, flying so low that chickens scattered and farm laborers ducked behind tractors. They learned to skim trees, follow rivers, and use the shadow of hills to dodge imaginary Allied spotters. The risk of crashing during training was almost as high as the risk of being shot down in the actual mission. The date was set for the dawn of August 22, 1944. The moment of maximum vulnerability for Patton's headquarters, located in the middle of a massive, complicated logistical move, coordinating the final push to the Seine. As the sun set on August 21, Major Scholl walked the flight line of his 18 specially prepared Ju-88 G6S. Fewer than 100 men, pilots, navigators, radio operators, and gunners, were about to embark on the Sonderkommando. They had been briefed on the target, but not the name of the target. They only knew they were going for the center, the primary nerve node of the entire American spearhead. They stood ready, 18 ghost ships stripped for speed, their crews fueled by a mixture of grim professionalism and the desperate hope that this counterlight might momentarily reverse the inevitable march of history. The trap had been set. Now, the German airmen had to fly straight into the heavily defended heart of their enemy's domain, trusting in audacity and the briefest moment of negligence to survive. The stage was set for one of the most forgotten, yet most strategically ambitious, air raids of the entire war. The true battle history tried to erase was not the planned, almost cinematic, dagger thrust against Patton's headquarters, which we now know was deemed strategically and logistically impossible by late August 1944. That original plot, the Ju-88 strike on Chartres, was too dependent on a single, lucky roll of the dice. The Luftwaffe was too weak, the fuel too precious, the distance too far. The real desperation, the one that birthed Operation Gegenlicht, was focused closer to home. It was born not of a desire to kill a general, but to halt the systematic, relentless demolition of the Reich's industrial heart. In June 1944, while the world watched the brutal dance of death on the beaches of Normandy, the men charged with defending the German homeland knew the Luftwaffe faced an extinction event. The numbers spoke a language too cruel to ignore. Allied bomber fleets were now vast cities of aluminum, protected by swarms of long-range fighters that could escort them from England to Berlin and back. The strategic consequences of Allied air dominance were paralyzing. Fuel shortages, not due to lack of crude oil, but due to the systematic obliteration of synthetic oil plants in the Ruhr and Saxony, meant that even if Germany produced 1,000 new planes, they could not fly them. Supply lines, already strained by the bleeding on the Eastern Front, were collapsing under the constant menace of the Jabot fighter bombers. Victory was not impossible, it was unthinkable. The mathematicians of doom. And yet, a small, almost fanatic circle of Luftwaffe engineers and senior tactical officers in the Reich Defense Command still believed in the miracle of the Wunderwaffe, or, failing that, the miracle of mathematical precision. These were men who looked not at the vast, overwhelming scale of the Allied attack, but at the minute flaws in its execution. They saw the giant machine, the bomber stream, as an algorithm, and every algorithm has a bug. This group was led, loosely, by Oberst Edgar Voss, a brilliant, obsessive tactician whose face often bore the soot smudges of the airfields he frequented. Voss had been tasked with finding an operational vulnerability, a way to inflict catastrophic losses on the American bomber formations without sacrificing the last vestiges of the Luftwaffe in a hopeless frontal charge. Voss and his analysts pored over thousands of reports, pilot debriefs, radio intercepts, flak trajectory data, searching for the moment of systemic weakness. The weakness was found not in Allied bravery, nor in their machines, but in the timing of their mission profiles over a specific corridor leading into the industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. The 20-minute blind spot. The heavy bomber fleets, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, often formed up over England before crossing the North Sea. But the approach to the Ruhr, particularly the leg involving the initial climb to attack altitude usually between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, to clear the dense weather systems that often clung to the western German border, created a momentary but profound operational vulnerability. For roughly 20 minutes each morning, as the massive formations executed a complex shift from cruising altitude to combat altitude, combined with maneuvering into the combat box defensive formation, their escort coverage temporarily dipped. The reason was twofold: fuel and altitude. The P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, while possessing superb range, were consuming their fuel reserves heavily during the formation keeping and high-G maneuvers necessary for the ascent. The escort leader often had to manage the fighter formation's climb rate carefully, temporarily lagging behind the bombers to conserve enough fuel for the grueling return trip over enemy territory. Weather and formation. If the bomber stream hit a patch of heavy cloud, the escort fighters, which sometimes flew above the cloud layer to conserve fuel or visibility, had to momentarily pull back or execute wider maneuvers to avoid colliding with the massive bomber formations climbing through the soup. This created a distance lag of several kilometers between the heavy formation of bombers and their protective, little friends. It wasn't a major vulnerability. The fighter escort would inevitably catch up, reposition, and close the gap. But for those 20 minutes, the bombers were temporarily, fractionally, less guarded. The vast, layered protection of the Allied air umbrella had a small tear in its fabric. And someone in the Reich Defense Command thought, what if we strike there? With everything unusual we have left. The strategic decision was made. The mission of Operation Gegenlicht would be a single, synchronized, devastating aerial hammer blow against this 20-minute weakness. The goal was to hit one bomber stream, not to destroy Germany, but to inflict such high losses, say, 20% of the stream, that the Allies would be forced to halt deep penetration raids for a week, or even two, to overhaul tactics, retrain crews, and morale could recover. This single, 2-week reprieve could allow the synthetic fuel plants to repair, production lines to catch up, and the German armies in the West to receive critical reinforcements. This was the counterlight, the wild gamble to buy precious time. But what force could possibly breach the defenses, hit the target, and escape in a single, lightning strike? The answer was the Frankenstein Air Unit. It was a cobbled-together strike group of desperation and genius, an operational unit so mismatched and unique it had no precedent, drawn from experimental workshops, test facilities, and desperate storage depots. The core of the unit: speed and shock. The unit, officially designated Sonderkommando 44 but quickly nicknamed the Circus, by its jaded ground crews, was centered around the most advanced, often flawed, products of German engineering. The Me-262 Swallow, Schwalbe, the unreliable Spearhead, the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, represented the future of air combat, and the agonizing failures of the German command structure. They were fast, terrifyingly fast, capable of outrunning any propeller-driven Allied aircraft. But the engines, particularly the early Jumo 04s, were temperamental, prone to catastrophic failure, and had a short operational life. For Gegenlicht, only 11 of the most reliable pre-production models could be spared. They were armed with the devastating 430mm Mk108 cannons. Their mission: use their speed advantage to slice through the bomber formation quickly, focusing on the formation leaders, and get out before the escort fighters could intercept. Their vulnerability was during takeoff and landing, and their limited fuel reserves. The Do-335 Aerophile, the uncatchable hunter if the Me-262 was fast, the Dornier Do-335 was a masterpiece of aerodynamic purity. With its unique tandem engine configuration, one in the nose, one pushing from the tail, it was the fastest propeller-driven aircraft ever flown by the Axis powers, capable of speeds that even the early jets struggled to match under certain conditions. Only 3 prototypes were functional enough for combat. They were used not as frontline fighters, but as high-speed bait and high-altitude heavy hitters. Armed with the massive 55mm Mk112 cannon, a test installation, or 30mm cannon and 2 15mm machine guns, the Do-335s were tasked with punching holes in the tightest knots of the combat box, using their speed to execute a single, brutal pass and vanish. The Me-163 Comet, the rocket-powered interceptor, the Messerschmitt Me, was less an airplane and more a manned, winged projectile. Fueled by highly volatile T-Stoff and C-Stoff propellants that were corrosive enough to dissolve human skin, the Comet launched vertically, burned its fuel in a terrifying ascent, and then glided down through the bomber formations. Only 6 were available, tasked with hitting the highest altitude boxes that often lagged behind the main stream. They carried no bombs, only powerful cannons. Their utility was limited by their short duration of powered flight, about 7.5 minutes, and the inherent danger of landing the highly explosive machine back on the ground, a risk the pilots had accepted as an occupational hazard, or perhaps, a grim certainty. The oddities and specialists. Filling out the rest of the unit were the aircraft that truly gave the Sonderkommando 44 its Frankenstein reputation. The Heinkel He-219 Owl UHU, the Night Hunter in daylight. The He-219 was perhaps the finest radar-equipped night fighter of the war, a sophisticated machine built for silent stalking and invisible kills. But here, a few were stripped of their heavy radar arrays, hastily repainted in daytime camouflage, and loaded with external cannons. 2 He-219s were pressed into service. Their advantage was their heavy firepower and their unusual silhouette, which might briefly confuse Allied gunners accustomed to fighting the smaller Me-109s. Their pilots, grizzled night hunters, hated the sun, which exposed their every mistake. The captured P-51 Mustang. The Trojan horse. The most audacious inclusion was a captured P-51B Mustang acquired after a forced landing, hastily repainted with Luftwaffe markings, but fitted with a non-standard German radio and an extra internal fuel tank. The plan was to use it for forward reconnaissance and distraction. Flown by Hauptmann Klaus Ender, a pilot who spoke perfect, fluent English, the Mustang was intended to fly ahead of the main force, potentially sowing confusion by mimicking Allied radio traffic or flying close to the bomber stream, momentarily drawing escort attention away from the real threat. It was a risky psychological weapon, a suicide pact of precision. In total, the Sonderkommando 44 numbered 22 unique aircraft. 22 machines against 1,000 bombers, defended by hundreds of the world's best fighters. The sheer disparity was staggering, but Voss insisted on the mathematical feasibility. The gap is time. 20 minutes of reduced escort effectiveness. The element is speed. The jets and fast prototypes must be in and out in less than 5 minutes. The goal is fear. Inflict maximum damage to the heart of the bomber box, creating panic and forcing the survivors to scatter and break formation, making them vulnerable to flak or the few remaining German squadrons. The pilots were a mixture of dedicated technicians, weary veterans, and fervent ideologues. Many were aces, plucked from relative safety for this one, all-consuming mission. They understood that Gegenlicht was not about saving Germany from invasion, it was about preventing the Reich from dissolving into cinder before the final battle was fought. They knew the danger. They knew the engines were ticking time bombs, the fuel was poisonous, and the odds were a statistical joke. But all that mattered was the timing, a single synchronized strike against the 1,000-bomber hammer blow. On the night of the strike, in a concealed hangar outside of Munster, the pilots stood by their strange, mismatched machines. The sleek, arrow-like Do-335 sat beside the stubby, explosive-laden Me-163, and the elegant, shark-like lines of the Me-262. Nothing matched. Nothing was standardized, and for the vast majority of the young pilots, the next morning would be their first and likely last time seeing such aircraft flying in a group. The air in the hangar was heavy with the smell of gasoline, cannon lubricant, and the acrid, metallic odor of the Comet's corrosive rocket fuel. The engines were warmed, the cannons loaded. The sun would rise in a few hours, revealing the perfect corridor over the Ruhr. They were about to plunge their small, strange force into the absolute, blinding light of Allied air dominance, betting everything that their counterlight would be enough to momentarily turn the tide. Interlude. The man in the wrong seat. To grasp the full weight of the gamble, one must look at the crew. Not the pilots, but the navigator of the Do-335, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ritter. Ritter was an 18-year-old radio operator from Stuttgart, barely old enough to shave, and he had drawn the unenviable task of navigating the fastest piston-engine plane in the world. He was terrified of speed. He preferred the sedate pace of the Heinkel bomber he used to fly. He was sitting in the Do-335 file, next to Major Schorner, a man who treated 600 km per hour as a Sunday cruise. Ritter's only job for the 5-minute strike window was to ensure the navigation beacon was exactly at a 90-degree angle relative to the bomber stream, a geometric calculation that had to be perfect. If he was off by even half a degree, the Me-262s, following their lead, would miss the vulnerable flank entirely. He looked out the canopy at the dawn sky, still tinted with nervous black. The irony wasn't lost on him. His life, and perhaps the future of the German war effort, depended on a 20-minute mistake made by the Americans, executed by a 5-minute burst of speed by a German plane, all controlled by a fraction of a degree on his trembling navigational chart. The morning of September 4, 1944, the date finally chosen for Operation Gegenlicht, was crisp and cold. The airfields around Munster and Kassel, where the Frankenstein units had been discreetly assembled, were shrouded in a faint, nervous mist that the rising sun had not yet burned away. The ground crews worked with the quiet efficiency of men who understood the futility of their task but were nonetheless devoted to its perfection. Each machine was a relic, a high-performance antique demanding constant, intricate attention. The Me-262 jets were towed carefully out of their hardened shelters. Their Jumo 004 engines, notorious for overheating, flameouts, and premature failure, were coddled with long, careful warm-ups. A single jet engine failure on the runway could scrap the entire, time-critical mission. The pilots, already encased in their leather flight suits, felt the vibration through their boots, the sound of an era changing, desperately. The young, intense pilots assigned to the 6 Me-163 Comet interceptors were strapped into their cramped cockpits. Their primary propellant, T-Stoff, was a solution of highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide that smoked and hissed, threatening to ignite at the slightest friction. These men were flying bombs with wings, designed for one, brief, terrifying climb into the stratosphere before gliding silently into combat. They felt less like pilots and more like human fuse links. But the most difficult start belonged to the Do-335 file. Major Schorner, the pilot, was struggling with the temperamental DB-603 engine in the tail. It spat oil and refused to catch consistently. Oberst Voss, the architect of the plan, stood nearby, his watch in his hand. Every second counted. If the file couldn't make its rendezvous with the bomber stream, the entire timing of the attack, the hinge upon which Gegenlicht was balanced, would be destroyed. The air was tense. This was not a standard Luftwaffe sortie. There was no bombastic propaganda, no cheerleading. Just a grim, professional acknowledgement that this was the last, best shot. The traitor in the formation, leading the entire strike force, however, was a deception worthy of a spy novel. Hauptmann Klaus Ender in the captured P-51 Mustang. Ender was a linguist before he was a pilot, and his mission was critical. His Mustang, hastily rechristened with a German designation, Luftwaffe testing sometimes applied the designation T9 plus UK for captured Western types, had been repainted in a dark, slightly scuffed Allied camouflage. He was instructed to fly 30 minutes ahead of the main formation, high above the main target corridor. Ender's job was to be the canary in the coal mine, and the Trojan horse. His task required utter nerve. He was to fly ahead of the bomber stream, but behind the initial Allied reconnaissance fighters, positioning himself to visually confirm the bomber formation's altitude shift and the resulting escort gap. Once he saw the gap open, he would begin to transmit fragmented, garbled, or distracting radio traffic on the American command frequency. Vector change. 30 degrees. Confirm fuel state. Ender would murmur in flawless, American-accented English. The goal was simple. Overload the already saturated Allied radio spectrum, distract the fighter screen leaders into unnecessary checks or delays, and by the 20-minute window an extra 30 seconds of confusion. If he was spotted by an actual American fighter, his death would be instantaneous. The Allied escort commanders would recognize the shape of a friendly aircraft, but they would never trust a lone, unidentified Mustang flying in front of the formation. They would shoot first and ask questions never. Ender's survival depended entirely on the fact that he looked exactly like every other little friend in the sky, provided he stayed just far enough away to avoid a close inspection. The rendezvous of the ghosts. As the Mustang soared into the pale yellow sunlight, the main strike group began its arduous, high-risk takeoff. The Me-262s were a spectacle of raw power. Their jet exhaust shimmered in the morning air, and the roar was unlike anything else, a terrifying, metallic hiss rather than the conventional drone of prop engines. They took off with long, agonizing runs, their unreliable engines whining dangerously. One, piloted by Lieutenant Schmidt, briefly feathered smoke from its starboard jet, causing a wave of visible panic on the ground, before the pilot nursed it into the air. The Do-335 finally started its tail engine with a violent shudder, the dual propellers cutting the air with a unique, aggressive rhythm. It was one of the last to take off, rapidly climbing to altitude, its pilot Major Schorner pushing the throttles hard, eager to regain the time lost in the engine trouble. The aircraft formed up in a loose, high-speed wedge, climbing toward the rendezvous point near the Belgian border. The cohesion was poor, the speeds were radically different. The Me-262s had to fly at inefficient, lower speeds to keep pace with the slower piston-engined He-219s. The entire formation looked like a collection of exotic parts rather than a cohesive military unit. This was the final tactical brilliance of Voss's plan. The Frankenstein unit was designed to fly in loose formation, not tight. It was meant to be seen as a confusing, disorganized scatter of radar contacts, a glitch in the Allied system. Each machine was assigned a separate, brief, and brutal task, timed to converge on the target corridor simultaneously. The enemy on the radar. At 7:45 a.m., the Allied bomber stream came into view on the Luftwaffe radar screens. It was huge, hundreds of dots, clustering together like a hostile constellation, heading directly for the industrial centers of Essen and Dortmund. The American airmen, flying in the B-17s of the 8th Air Force, felt the usual mix of icy dread and grim determination. Below them lay Flak Alley, where the German anti-aircraft batteries were thickest. Above and around them were the Mustangs and Thunderbolts, their silver wings glinting, the comforting symbol of safety. The bomber stream began its pre-planned altitude climb. The radio crackled with standard operating procedure. Form B, climb to 27,000. Maintain visual spacing. This was the moment. The combination of the heavy fuel burn during the climb and the need for the P-51s to fly wider arcs to maintain their position relative to the B-17s created the 20-minute, 3-kilometer gap. In the cockpit of the captured Mustang, Hauptmann Ender watched the formation from 20,000 feet above. The sight was overwhelming. The full, destructive majesty of the Allied air power. He keyed his microphone, adopting the smooth, slightly nasal inflection of an American squadron leader. Bandit report. Possible contrail. Vector 310. Investigate. Yellow leader. Over. He knew there was no yellow leader in that sector. He knew he was gambling on confusion. But the transmission, delivered over the American frequency, forced a momentary pause. An escort commander had to check his logs, confirm the sector, and possibly divert a pair of fighters to investigate a non-existent threat. For the Me-262s now screaming over the Rhine, flying at maximum speed on their dangerous low-altitude approach, those few seconds of Allied indecision were life itself. The final approach. Below the radar, the Sonderkommando 44 climbed, their speed blurring the French and Belgian countryside. The air was now filled with the roar of 24 unique engines. Major Schorner in the Do-335, his face tight with focus, banked hard, bringing the file around to the exact coordinate. Oberleutnant Ritter, the nervous young navigator, stared at his instruments, confirming the 90-degree angle to the approaching enemy line. The file's role was to be the battering ram, the one that hit the vulnerable flank first. Behind him, the Me-262s, now free to accelerate to their higher, more efficient combat speed, began their climb, their jets howling in anticipation. And then, the rockets. The Me-163 Comets, their pilots breathing shallowly to avoid inhaling any fumes, hit the activation switch. The acceleration was violent, brutal, and stunning. They became vertical streaks of fire, climbing at phenomenal rates, aiming to punch through the highest, most sparsely defended layers of the bomber formation. They were flying on a fixed vector, committed to a course that they could not alter once their fuel was spent. The radio silence broke only once, a single, hoarse German voice from one of the pilots, perhaps a Comet pilot, now in the sky, fully committed. Gegenlicht. Attack. The forgotten battle was about to begin. A handful of unique, mismatched machines, piloted by men fueled by desperation, was about to plunge into the heart of the mightiest air armada the world had ever seen, exploiting a technical weakness that lasted only minutes. The fate of the entire week's bombing effort, and perhaps the duration of the Western War, hung in the balance over the smoking chimneys of the Ruhr. This is the next segment of the detailed, long-form narrative for Operation Gegenlicht. I will continue to expand the story, focusing on the cinematic action and technical details of the attack and its collapse. The silence before the storm was agonizing. For the American bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, the morning of July 13, 1944, a date permanently seared into the few surviving German records of the operation, felt like any other. It was a monotonous grind of engine noise, cold air, and the constant threat of flak. The formation was the famous combat box, a complex, staggered array designed to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire from the bomber's dozens of machine guns. It was the epitome of strategic aerial warfare, strength in numbers, discipline in formation. At 9:41 a.m., everything changed. The bomber stream, heading toward the oil targets near Leuna and the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, was executing the crucial altitude shift. They were climbing through the high troposphere, where temperature gradients and shifting cloud banks forced the pilots to concentrate fully on maintaining spacing. The P-51 Mustang escorts, the reliable, little friends, were indeed lagging. They were still 3 kilometers behind and climbing hard, struggling to maintain the pace and altitude efficiency required. The fighter pilots knew this was their most vulnerable phase, but they relied on the vast distance of German-held territory separating them from the forward airfields. It was simply too far for conventional fighter attack. They had not accounted for the speed of the future. The spearhead of shock, the Schwalbe. The German attack did not begin with a slow, conventional climb, it began with a rip in the fabric of the sky. The 11 Me-262 Schwalbe jets appeared not as dots on the horizon, but as streaking black arrows, emerging from the thin cloud layer directly beneath the bomber formation. They tore through the bomber stream at speeds no American pilot had ever witnessed in combat, over 800 kilometers per hour in the high-altitude dive. The shock was total. The American gunners, trained to spot the slow, lumbering approach of FW-190s or Me-109s, barely registered the jet's passage before it was gone. Major Erich Scholl, the Sonderkommando commander, led the first element of 3 jets, targeting the lead B-17s of the high box. His 430mm Mk108 cannons, weapons that fired explosive shells the size of soft drink cans, unleashed a devastating torrent. The shells were low velocity but had a terrifying impact. A single burst of 3 or 4 rounds was enough to blow apart the hydraulics, shatter the cockpit, or shred a wing spar. B-17 inches, the pride of Peoria, took the first hit. The shells ripped into the port wing's inner engine, turning the nacelle into a ball of white-hot magnesium. The bomber, fully loaded with fuel and bombs, immediately dipped out of formation, trailing a thick plume of black smoke, spiraling down toward the unforgiving German earth. The jets performed their signature attack, the high-speed slashing pass. They zoomed through the formation, inflicted damage with terrifying speed, and simply vanished into the distance before the Allied gunners could traverse their heavy machine guns quickly enough to lock on. The Arrow and the Owl. Following the devastating shock of the jets came the piston engine monstrosities, the Do-335 Pfeil and the He-219 UHU. The 3 Do-335s, led by Major Schorner, used the gaps the Me-262s had opened. These aircraft were heavy, powerfully armed, and utilized their fantastic speed to smash through the second defensive layer. Schorner, using the nose-mounted 30mm cannon and the heavy propeller wash, targeted the waist gunners and the tail gunners, the eyes of the combat box. The Pfeil dove like a bird of prey, its unique tandem engine configuration lending it a fearsome, aggressive profile. Its mission was not to cause mass destruction but to systematically blind the formation, eliminating the defensive firepower on the flanks and in the rear, making subsequent passes easier for the slower aircraft. In a breathtakingly aggressive maneuver, one of the Do-335s dove under a B-24 formation, firing upward with a burst of cannon fire, riddling the bomber's unprotected belly and turning its bomb bay into Swiss cheese. The bomber exploded seconds later, a brilliant, terrifying flower of smoke and aluminum that threatened to take out its neighbors. Meanwhile, the 2 He-219 Nachtjäger, flown by pilots accustomed to the total darkness, used their trained sight and stripped-down radar equipment, retaining a very basic homing system, not for tracking but for identifying isolated, damaged stragglers that the main formation had abandoned. In the bright daylight, the heavy cannons of the UHU were brutally effective against aircraft already struggling to stay aloft. The meteors. The Me-163 Comet. The most cinematic, and most terrifying, element of Gegenlicht was the arrival of the Me-163 comets. These 6 rocket fighters were the final nail in the coffin of American composure. Having burned their highly volatile fuel in a terrifying vertical climb, they appeared high above the main formation, silent, terrifying, and gliding toward their prey. They didn't execute passes, they executed punches. The Comet pilots used their incredible rate of descent to dive through the very heart of the formation. They were moving so fast that their small size made them nearly invisible until they were upon the bombers. They fired their weapons, often 30mm cannons or experimental systems like the 50mm Mk214, in brief, violent bursts. The Comet was a force of nature, an aircraft that defied all conventional rules of combat. One American pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Smith, later recounted in his debriefing that the Comet was a blur of fire and silence. It didn't fight, it simply ripped through us like a meteor. The Germans knew the Comets only had enough thrust for a single attack. So they made it count. 3 bombers were instantly destroyed by the Comet passes, their wreckage showering down on the French countryside. The radio call that history tried to erase the full, synchronized assault lasted exactly 7 minutes. By 9:48 a.m., the damage was horrifying. Initial post-battle assessments, German and later Allied, suggested that at least 18 heavy bombers were destroyed or terminally damaged, and dozens more were severely crippled. This loss rate, in a 7-minute period, was catastrophic, far exceeding the average attrition rate for an entire 4-hour mission. The combat box was disintegrating. Formations were broken, discipline was cracking, and the sky was suddenly full of parachutes and falling metal. This was the moment that should have changed everything. It was the only time in the entirety of the Western Air War in 1944 when American bomber crews radioed a message that transcended tactical warning and descended into pure, professional terror. We are being overrun. Repeat, we are being overrun. Where are the escorts? God, we are being overrun. If the German attack could have sustained itself for another 10 minutes, the entire bomber stream would have been forced to abort, scattering the unescorted formations for the waiting flak batteries below and the few conventional German fighters circling nearby. Operation Gegenlicht had achieved its primary objective, the psychological paralysis of the enemy. And then, just as suddenly, the counterlight began to flicker and die. The Achilles heel of the Frankenstein unit was not the enemy, it was the experimental nature of the machines themselves. Voss's brilliant tactical gamble had been undone by Germany's own technological desperation. The Me-262 failure. The Me-262 was the first to fall victim to its own volatility. The Jumo 004 jet engines were rated for extremely high speeds only briefly. Flying them at high power settings for sustained periods, required for the long approach and the multiple slashing passes, led to rapid overheating. 2 of the jets suffered catastrophic engine failures. They didn't simply stop. They flamed out violently, spitting shrapnel and white-hot gases. The pilots, forced to glide their heavy, wing-loaded aircraft down from altitude, became targets for the returning, furious Allied fighters. 3 other jets experienced severe power loss, forcing them to abort their attack runs and limp toward the nearest German-held territory, flying blind and terrified at low altitude. The Do-335 disaster. The Do-335 file was an aerodynamic marvel, but a nightmare to fly in formation. It was heavy, fast, and notoriously difficult to handle at the high angles of attack required for close-in fighting. In the chaotic aftermath of the main jet attack, 2 of the 3 file prototypes, maneuvering wildly to avoid the debris field of the exploding B-17s, suffered a disastrous loss of situational awareness. They were flying through a momentary, dense patch of smoke and cloud. The collision was instantaneous and total. Major Schorner's lead file clipped the wingtip of its wingman, Lieutenant Richter. The impact tore off Schorner's outer wing panel. Both planes tumbled, spinning violently out of the sky. 2 of Germany's most advanced prototypes, destroyed not by Allied guns, but by the sheer, unmanageable chaos of their own operation. The Comet's grim fate. The Me-163 Comets, having executed their spectacular one-time pass, were now simply gliders. Their highly concentrated fuel had been exhausted. Their pilots, now relying on aerodynamics alone, were the most vulnerable of all. They were too fast to land safely near the target, and too slow to outrun anything on the glide home. One Comet, attempting a low-level glide toward a distant German-held strip, was intercepted by a lone, late-arriving P-47 Thunderbolt and exploded in a massive, chemical fireball, the T-Stoff and C-Stoff combining on impact. The 5 remaining Comets were forced to land at primitive, improvised airfields, far from immediate repair or refueling, effectively taking them out of the war permanently. The final irony, the Trojan horse. And then came the final, cruel twist of irony, epitomizing the doomed nature of Operation Gegenlicht, the fate of the Trojan horse. Hauptmann Klaus Ender in the captured P-51 Mustang was orbiting high above, attempting to sow further radio confusion as the initial attack was underway. He had gambled on being mistaken for a friendly, but the appearance of the Mi-262s, and the panic that followed, had shattered all protocols. A returning flight of 3 P-51D models, fresh from escorting a separate, smaller bomber stream, spotted the lone Mustang. It was flying erratically, close to the scene of destruction. Its camouflage was subtly off, and its maneuvers were too aggressive for a fighter attempting to recover a downed pilot. More damningly, Ender was attempting to radio a German squadron below, transmitting a final report on the success of the initial pass. He momentarily forgot to switch to the Luftwaffe band. A quick-thinking American radio operator intercepted the clear German dialogue, spoken in the plane with American markings. The American fighters, needing no further confirmation, converged. Ender's Mustang was instantly targeted. He was shot down not by enemy skill, but by friendly fire, mistaken for a spy attempting to finish off the stragglers. The captured Mustang, the symbol of tactical brilliance, was vaporized in the air, a victim of its own success and the resulting chaos. The entire German strike force had crippled itself in under 15 minutes. The counterlight had been brilliant, but fleeting, a single flash in the dark. And at 9:55 a.m., the tide turned with brutal finality. The long-range P-51 Mustang escorts, having closed the 3-kilometer gap in a furious, high-speed sprint, arrived over the target area. They did not arrive to a battle, they arrived to an execution. The scene they found was apocalyptic. Dozens of parachutes, debris raining down, and the sight of struggling, damaged German aircraft attempting desperate escapes at low altitude. The Mustang pilots, enraged by the sight of the carnage inflicted on their children, the bombers they were sworn to protect, flew with a terrifying, vengeful energy. The 2 surviving, badly battered He-219s were too slow to evade the P-51s. They were quickly overwhelmed, their bulky night fighting frames unable to withstand the speed and agility of the American fighters. Both were shot down within 3 minutes of the escort's arrival. The remaining 6 serviceable Mi-262s, now critically low on fuel and nursing temperamental engines, could only try to escape on the deck. They used their sheer speed, skimming the treetops, hoping the Mustangs wouldn't risk ground fire. But the P-51 pilots were relentless. The jets could outrun the Mustangs in a straight line, but the heavy German fighters were vulnerable during high G turns. 2 more jets were caught and destroyed by pilots executing high-speed, curving dives. By 10:08 a.m., Operation Counterlight was officially over. Of the 22 unique aircraft that launched Operation Gegenlicht, only 3 Mi-262s and 1 badly damaged Tu-335, which limped to a distant airfield, returned to German-held territory. The loss rate was over 80% of the strike force. The tactical genius of the plan had been utterly negated by the technological immaturity of the execution. The Americans had lost 18 heavy bombers, a devastating, paralyzing blow that did indeed force a 2-day stand-down of deep penetration raids while commanders re-evaluated tactics and logistics. The German gambit had won the time it sought, but the cost was the annihilation of the most advanced, irreplaceable element of the Luftwaffe's inventory, the only operational prototypes of their future fleet, and the sacrifice of many of their most skilled test pilots and veteran aces. The counterlight had worked, but only by destroying the ability of the Luftwaffe to ever attempt such an operation again. A brilliant strike, a catastrophic failure, and a battle that was quietly buried by both sides, by the Germans, who could not admit such a sacrifice for a temporary delay, and by the Americans, who could never admit the full extent of the shock and vulnerability they experienced in those 7 minutes over the Ruhr.